Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 276 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the 35 Whelen. I have gotten a lot of requests for an episode about this cartridge, especially after my recent episode about the 9.3 by 62 millimeter Mauser. And that episode with the 9.3 was episode 267, so check that out if you haven't already done so. But like I said, today we're talking about the 35 Whelen. Now, most hunters, especially American hunters, but really people all over the world, probably agree that the legendary 30-06 Springfield is an outstanding all-around hunting cartridge. While it is indeed an excellent choice for many uses, it's not perfect for every single hunting situation. In particular, there's some stuff towards the larger end of the big game hunting spectrum where the 30-06 will work, but it just leaves a little bit of performance to be desired. So some people want something that's a little bit bigger and more powerful. Well, that is where cartridges like the 35 Whelen come in. Now, it's not nearly as well known as the 30-06, but the 35 Whelen has been around for well over a century, and it is very highly regarded in some hunting circles. Like the 30-06, it is flexible enough for use on a variety of game in North America and elsewhere in the world. However, it does have a big advantage over the 30-06 in situations where hunters might want a larger and heavier hitting cartridge. So in this episode, I discuss the history as well as the strengths and weaknesses of the 35 Whelen in detail. And I also provide some information on how the 35 Whelen compares to cartridges like the 30-06, as well as the 9.3 by 62 millimeter Mauser and the 375 H&H. So you can get an idea of what sort of performance you can expect from it and see what fits your needs the best. Before we get started talking about the 35 Whelen, make sure you're on my email list. I know I talk about this every week, but I know there's people that listen to the podcast that are not on the email list for whatever reason. You are missing out. I'm not joking when I hear from people all the time that respond to my emails saying how much they look forward to hearing from me every day and how much they enjoy reading those emails I send out. They're entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. So if you like the podcast, you're probably going to really enjoy these emails too. So make sure you are getting those emails as well by clicking the link in the show notes or going to huntingguns101.com and signing up there. And additionally, if you like this podcast, make sure you are subscribed to it as well. Just hit pause right now, go to whatever podcast listening app you're listening to, Spotify, Apple, whatever, it doesn't matter. Hit that follow or subscribe button in that app, and you'll start receiving my new podcast episodes automatically every Thursday when I release them. Okay, let's get started talking about the 35 Whelen. The 35 Whelen is somewhat unusual in that the exact origins of the cartridge aren't 100% clear. Now, Colonel Townsend Whelen was one of America's foremost gun writers and had a hand in designing a number of different rifle cartridges in the early 20th century. Now, of these, the 35 Whelen is probably the most famous and most widely used. Interestingly, though, his role in designing the cartridge is disputed, with many historians believing that James Howe, of Griffin and Howe fame, actually designed the 35 Whelen and simply named it after Townsend Whelen. But a lot of people also think that Townsend Whelen likely did contribute to the development of that cartridge to a certain degree. Now, Townsend Whelen was the commander of the U.S. government-owned Frankfurt Arsenal, and James Howe was the shop foreman there for a period of time as well when Whelen was the commander. So the two men definitely knew each other, they definitely worked together, and it seems beyond dispute that they collaborated on a number of projects. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details here, though. Regardless of who exactly did most of the work designing this cartridge, Whelen is forever linked to it, and it's pretty clear that whatever his involvement was in actually designing the 35 Whelen, he was indeed a big booster of that cartridge, similar to Jack O'Connor with the 270 Winchester. Now, in contrast to the exact origins of the cartridge, the design of the 35 Whelen is very simple, very clear. It's a 30-06 Springfield case necked up to use .358 caliber bullets instead of .308 caliber bullets. Now, Townsend Whelen discusses a couple of specific loads for the cartridge in an article he wrote for the 15 September 1923 edition of The American Rifleman. In particular, he talks about a load firing a 200 grain bullet at 2,834 feet per second for 3,566 foot-pounds of energy, and another load firing a 250 grain bullet at 2,635 feet per second for 3,854 foot-pounds of energy. Modern ballistics for the cartridge using modern factory ammo, modern rifles, are very similar, but a tiny bit slower than those ballistics that he published there. Now, we'll talk more about the details of how the 35 Whelen compares to the 30-06 here in a minute, but it's obvious at first glance that the 35 Whelen provides a significant jump up in performance over the old 30-06, and indeed fires a 200 grain bullet about as fast, sometimes even faster, than the 30-06 can fire a 180 grain bullet. Not only that, but since it is descended directly from the 30-06, the 35 Whelen still fits in a standard length rifle action with the same size bolt face as the 30-06. Now, converting a 30-06 rifle over to 35 Whelen was very simple as well, and the same was true with reforming 30-06 brass to 35 Whelen brass. So it filled that gap that existed at the time between the 30-06, originally developed for the Army, and the relatively expensive and much more difficult to obtain, back then anyway, Magnum cartridges like the 375 H&H. This is how the cartridge got the nickname the poor man's Magnum. There's a saying that I really like that I learned back when I was in the Army, and I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but it goes, amateurs study tactics and professionals study logistics. Now, in the context of guns and ammo and firearms, cartridges, that sort of thing, the quote-unquote tactics part of that is how good it looks on paper. Okay, yeah, this cartridge could fire a bullet of this weight, this fast, at this BC, etc. The logistics side of that has to do with the availability and cost of rifles and ammunition. It's not enough to have a cartridge that has ballistics that look great on paper. All of the supporting factors need to be in place too, or nobody's going to use it. Well, the 35 Whelen filled a screaming vacancy in the cartridge world at the time. Remember, we're talking about the 1920s. Hunters had pretty limited options for powerful centerfire rifle cartridges designed for use in bolt-action rifles back then. The 7mm Rim Mag, 300 Win Mag, 338 Win Mag, and 458 Win Mag would not come along for several more decades. The same was true for all the Weatherby Magnums. There were a number of cartridges out there like the 30-30 Winchester, the 33 Winchester centerfire, the 405 Winchester, and the 45-70 that were designed for use in lever action or single-shot rifles. However, those were all pretty low-pressure, low-velocity cartridges that, while they were effective in some circumstances, they had a pretty limited effective range. And really, lever-action rifles were starting to lose market share to more modern bolt-action rifles after World War I. Gigantic wars like that where literally millions of young men are packed up, shipped off to a foreign and exotic location that is completely alien to the life that they were living prior to the war, has all sorts of impacts on society later on down the line. For instance, in the early 20th century, men did not wear wristwatches. Those were things that women wore. Real men used a pocket watch. Well, wristwatches became very popular because they were much more practical to use in warfare, like they were experiencing at the time in the trenches. And so it got to the point where almost every man that was in the Army was wearing a wristwatch when they came home from World War I. So as you can imagine, that was a gigantic change to the fashion industry, and it really continues to this day. The same thing was true with rifles. Guys that maybe grew up with a single shot or a lever action rifle to hunt with, they got a taste of using a modern, high-powered bolt action rifle with that either 1917 Enfield or 1903 Springfield in the 30-06 cartridge. They thought that was amazing. They wanted rifles and cartridges like that for themselves. So that had a massive impact on the firearms industry in the years after the war as well. Well, at the time, there weren't a lot of centerfire rifle cartridges suitable for use in a bolt-action rifle. Really, at the time, they had the 3040 Krag, the 30-06, the 270 starting in 1925, and that was about it. There were various European cartridges like the 6.5 Swede, the 7mm Mauser, the 9.3x62, the 375 H&H, and the 416 Rigby, but none of those cartridges were really popular in North America at the time. This was mainly because rifles and ammunition for all of them were both expensive and difficult to source for the typical American hunter. I'm going to read a paragraph about the 35 Whelen from page 692 of the 10th edition Hornady Reloading Handbook that really emphasizes this point. At the time of its introduction, a Magnum Mauser action alone cost about the price of 2 complete domestic sporting rifles, and hunters wanting a rifle which would approximate the power of the big 375 H&H had to dig deep in their pockets to achieve their goal. But the 35 Whelen gave hunters a fine, low-cost alternative. The cartridge was short enough to work in the standard-length 30-06 action, conversion to the 35 Whelen was simple, and cases could be made easily by running 30-06 brass over a 35 caliber expander plug. Though 35 Whelen performance falls several hundred feet per second short of 375 velocities with comparable bullets, the 35 Whelen is nevertheless a potent, accurate, and dependable medium to big game hunting cartridge. End of quote. So as you can see, the 35 Whelen was set up for success from the very beginning, both on a tactical and a logistics standpoint. It was very easy to convert a Springfield rifle or any other 30-06 rifle to the cartridge, and the same thing was true with 30-06 brass, both of which were widely available in the United States. All you needed was some .358 caliber bullets, which were available as component bullets originally designed for some of the other 35 caliber cartridges of the day, like the 35 Remington. So convert a rifle and some brass over to 35 Whelen, use appropriate bullets, work up a load, and boom, you got a heavy-hitting rifle cartridge that's a big step up in power over the 30-06. That is a whole lot easier to obtain ammo and rifles for compared to European cartridges like the 375, but it also still works really well. Hunters especially appreciated the effectiveness of the cartridge on large animals like moose and brown bear. While cartridges like the 4570 were and still are valued for their effectiveness on these same animals, the 35 Whelen has several attributes that helped it set apart from other quote-unquote big hitters of the day. So first, the 35 Whelen had a relatively flat trajectory almost on par with the 30-06. Next, it had very good terminal performance out to several hundred yards. More on this in a second. It's not quite on the level of the 375, but it is a major jump up in power over the 30-06. So it really did stand out on especially big, tough, and or dangerous game like elk, moose, and brown bear. And it also had a surprisingly mild recoil. That being said, and notwithstanding the surprisingly large appeal of the cartridge, it is still somewhat of a niche round. Most people don't really hunt the really, really big stuff, and the cartridges like the 270 and the 30-06 were perfect for use on deer. Now, those reasons, combined with the limited sources of ammunition and rifles resulting from the quote-unquote wildcat roots of the 35 Whelen, restricted the appeal of the cartridge to a somewhat narrow segment of the population. These factors, along with the neither fish nor fowl nature of 35 caliber cartridges in general, does explain why the cartridge never made it into really, really widespread use in the United States. For many years, factory-loaded ammo was essentially non-existent. And at the same time, rebarreled Mausers and Springfields made up the vast majority of 35 Whelen rifles until the 1980s when Remington started producing factory ammo as well as rifles chambered in the cartridge. Now, Remington has had some big misses over the years and really flubbed their rollout of otherwise well-designed cartridges like the 260 Remington and the 280 Remington. However, the company does have a really good track record of taking popular wildcats and legitimizing them. They did this with the 22-250 Remington, the 25-06 Remington, and the 7mm 08 Remington. Well, they did that with the 35 Whelen as well, and that is a big part of the reason why it is still hanging around today. So how does it stack up to other cartridges? Well, the 30-06, the 9.3x62, and the 375 H&H Magnum are the three cartridges most often compared to the 35 Whelen. So, I decided to compare these 4 cartridges with a couple of different factory loads. So for the 35 Whelen, I used 200 grain Federal Fusion with a .343 BC and 225 grain AccuBond bullets with a .43 BC. Compared those 2 loads for the 35 Whelen to Nosler Trophy grade loads for the 30-06. 9.3 by 62 and 375 H&H. They're all firing AccuBond bullets. You got a 180 AccuBond with a .507 BC for the 30-06, a 250 AccuBond bullet with a .494 BC for the 9.3, and a 300 grain AccuBond with a .485 bullet for the 375. Now that 200 grain fusion load for the 35 Whelen is pretty pedestrian, and it uses a lower BC bullet. So that's kind of the lower end of the spectrum of performance that you'll get for the 35 Whelen. It's still a really good load for all-around performance for that cartridge, but there's nothing special with it. On the other hand, that 225 grain AccuBond load represents something of a quote-unquote best-case scenario for the 35 Whelen with a pretty high BC bullet pushed at a velocity that's near the upper bound of what that cartridge is capable of. Now, the 30-06 is no slouch, but comparing these loads, the 35 Whelen is significantly more powerful, especially at close range. Those 2 35 Whelen loads have 15 to 20% more kinetic energy at the muzzle. That advantage does diminish as range increases, and even flips in favor of the 30-06 compared to that 200 grain Fusion around 200 yards because the 30-06 uses higher BC bullets. However, that 225 grain 35 Whelen load maintains an advantage all the way out to 500 yards. And even that 200 grain load has a pretty big edge inside 100, maybe 150 yards or so. Now, on the other hand, the 30-06 does have a flatter trajectory than both 35 Whelen loads. At 500 yards, the 30-06 has 5, 6, 7 inches less bullet drop than the 2 35 Whelen loads, but that's much smaller at closer range. We're really only looking at maybe less than an inch of difference between these 3 loads at 300 yards. So not a tremendous amount of difference here, and we're not talking 300 Win Mag or 7 Rim Mag or 6.5 PRC quote-unquote flat trajectory here, but especially considering just everything about the 35 Whelen, pretty darn good on the trajectory front. In that vein, the 35 Whelen does have a little bit flatter trajectory than the 9.3 by 62 millimeter Mauser. Things are a little different in the energy department. The 9.3 has about a 3 to 4% edge over the 200 grain 35 Whelen load in terms of muzzle energy, but the 225 35 Whelen load actually has a tiny bit more kinetic energy at the muzzle. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that the 2 cartridges are virtually twins ballistically. They're really, really darn close. Yeah, like I said, it's a little bit flatter trajectory for the 35 Whelen, and the 9.3 does use a little bit higher BC bullet here, so it does pull ahead in the energy department, but, at the closer ranges where these cartridges are best utilized, say 300 yards and in, we're talking about 5% difference between the energy of the 35 Whelen 225 load and that 9.3 load, like I said, at 300 yards, and that difference is even smaller at closer range. So they're both really solid performers here, and a tiny bit of change in muzzle velocity for one or the other, going from just one rifle to another, one load to another, different barrel lengths, that sort of thing, is also going to give you differences in velocity that could also mess up these results as well. So they're just almost identical, like I said. Now, moving up to the 375, even that load here only has about 5 to 10% more kinetic energy than the 2 35 Whelen loads. And the 35 Whelen does have an even more significant edge in terms of trajectory over the 375 than it does over the 9.3. Now, there are some other 375 H&H loads that deliver between 4,000 and 4,200 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle, though. That works out to about a 15 to 20% advantage in favor of the 375. So about the same difference between the 35 Whelen and the 30-06 as is the case with the 35 Whelen and the 375. Yeah, it's a heavy hitter. It's really good for a lot of stuff, but it's just not quite up there with the 375. But you do have a little bit bigger advantage in terms of trajectory here. But while it's bigger, it's not tremendous. We're talking an inch and a half about of difference in trajectory at 300 yards, which once again is where these cartridges really, I think, are most effective, 300 yards and in. Let's talk about recoil. Now, comparing hand loads that are very similar to those AccuBond loads for the 30-06, 35 Whelen, 9.3, and 375 from identical rifles, you see that the 35 Whelen has recoil virtually identical to the 9.3, a little more than the 30-06, and quite a bit less than the 375. Many hunters can handle the recoil of all those cartridges, but the 375 often represents towards the upper end of what the typical hunter can deal with. So the 35 Whelen does have an edge in this respect. It has 20 to 30% more recoil than a typical 30-06, and like I said, about the same as the 9.3, and at least in this weight of rifle, remember we're looking at 8-pound rifles here for all of them, has about 50% less recoil than the 375. Now, remember, we're talking about identical rifles for all 4 cartridges right here, 8-pound rifles to be specific. The 375 is pretty common in rifles that are around 9 to 10 pounds. So in a little bit heavier rifle like that, recoil for the 375 will drop down a little bit in terms of just pure calculated free recoil energy. It's still going to be more than the 35 Whelen, though, but the downside is that it's a heavier rifle. All right, let's talk about a couple of other factors. So first, the 35 Whelen uses larger diameter bullets than the 30-06. Now those 3.58 caliber bullets have about 35% more frontal surface area than the 3.08 caliber bullets used by the 30-06. All other things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss. That's a big advantage in favor of the 35 Whelen, especially on bigger game. We're not quite on the level of the 9.3 or 375 in this area, though. Their 3.66 caliber and 3.75 caliber bullets have approximately 4.5% more and about 10% greater frontal surface area than the 35 Whelen, respectively. But when you compare this fact with the fact that the 35 Whelen carries a lot more kinetic energy downrange than the 30-06, those larger caliber bullets can be helpful when hunting big game, especially really big stuff like elk, moose, and the big bears. What about the really big species of game, though? Cape buffalo, elephant, hippo, etc. This is where the 35 Whelen just falls a little bit short and where the 9.3 and the 3.75 in particular really start to shine. Yes, it can definitely be done, and I know people have cleanly killed both buffalo and elephant with the 35 Whelen, but it's really just a little bit too light for me to advocate using it for that work. This is for a couple reasons. First, the 35 Whelen falls short of the legal energy and caliber requirements for hunting thick-skinned, dangerous game in most African countries. Details vary from country to country, but 3.75 caliber is usually the minimum legal caliber for thick-skinned, dangerous game in most African countries. Zimbabwe has that weird 9.2 millimeter minimum. Really, I think was just designed to legalize the 9.3 in that country. But even that, the 35 Whelen just barely falls short of 9.2 millimeters. So it falls short of that legal minimum caliber, plus most countries also have a minimum muzzle energy requirement of around 4,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy to legally hunt thick-skinned dangerous game. Once again, exact details vary a little bit here. Here's 2 examples. Zimbabwe has a legal minimum energy of 5,300 joules, which works out to about 3,900 foot-pounds of energy to hunt game like buffalo, hippo, and elephant. Namibia has a minimum energy requirement of 5,400 joules, which is about 3,982 foot-pounds of energy for hunting buffalo, elephant, and rhino. Now, the 35 Whelen comes close, but most factory loads still fall just a little bit short of those marks. Interestingly, the Wildcat 35 Whelen Ackley Improved does meet that minimum energy threshold, and Mike Arnold actually used that cartridge to cleanly take a Cape buffalo in Mozambique. Even then, I don't know that I would necessarily advocate or recommend someone use that cartridge for hunting buffalo, but you can do it, and you can learn a little bit more about Mike Arnold and that particular hunt that I was referring to in episode 213. Next, the 35 Whelen is just a little bit lacking in the bullet sectional density department, at least with the most common bullet weights for that cartridge. It does fall a little bit short of the generally accepted minimum recommended bullet sectional density of 0.300 for use on thick-skinned dangerous game. Now, sectional density is a measure of the ratio of the diameter of a projectile to its mass. All other things being equal, a heavier bullet of a given caliber will be longer and therefore have a higher sectional density and, consequently, probably penetrate better than projectiles with a lower mass and lower sectional density. All other things being equal here, of course. Well, For instance, 200 grain, 225 grain, and 250 grain .358 caliber bullets have sectional densities of .223, .251, and .279 respectively. A 270 grain .358 caliber bullet would give you a sectional density of .301, but you don't see a lot of 270 grain bullet weights. They're there, but they're just not very common. Now, Swift actually does make a 280 grain A-frame in .358 caliber with a sectional density of .312, but that is really the only 35 caliber bullet in that weight range I'm aware of, at least among the big manufacturers. So yeah, you could potentially get it, but they are kind of rare. Now, that particular bullet would probably work pretty well in a Cape Buffalo, though, for someone who insisted on using the cartridge in that role. With all that said, though, the 35 Whelen just was not designed for dangerous game hunting in Africa. No, it was designed to be a heavier-hitting, bigger brother to the 30-06 that was better suited for the really big and dangerous species of North American game, and it absolutely excels in that role. I would not hesitate one bit to use the 35 Whelen on brown or grizzly bear in Alaska or Canada. Same is true on elk, moose, American bison, or literally any species of African plains game. And really, the same thing would apply in other places in the world as well. Europe, South America, the South Pacific, hunting stuff like red stag or Scandinavian moose, big brown bears in Europe, etc. The details are a little bit outside the scope of this episode, but the 400 Whelen is the bigger brother to the 35 Whelen. While the 35 Whelen was designed from the start to excel on North American game, the 400 Whelen was intended for use on even bigger creatures like buffalo and elephant in Africa. It was built along the exact same lines as the 35 Whelen, and the 400 Whelen is literally just a 30-06 necked up to shoot 41 caliber bullets. That cartridge is capable of launching a 400 grain .4115 caliber bullet, which has an impressive .337 sectional density in excess of 2,150 feet per second for about 4,100 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Those are darn impressive figures, and as you're listening to this, you can probably tell that the 400 Whelen would check all the boxes for those specific areas where the 35 Whelen was just a little bit lacking for use on thick-skinned species of African dangerous game in terms of both practicality and on the legal side of things. I actually know a guy that brought a 400 Whelen over to Africa several years ago. He used it with great success on Cape Buffalo as well as a wide range of plains game. It performed beautifully over there. Unfortunately, the 400 Whelen just had a lot of other problems that really hampered widespread acceptance in the hunting community. And really, that's why that cartridge is just so darn rare today, even compared to the still kind of rare, but not really rare, 35 Whelen. But for those that have rifles and can source ammo in 400 Whelen through reloading or whatever, even so, for guys like I just talked about that already have a good 400 Whelen rifle and can source ammo from one source or another, be it hand loading or something else, that is absolutely outstanding performance from a rifle cartridge that fits in a standard linked rifle action and also utilizes a standard size bolt face. And really, it's probably delivering very close to the maximum possible performance that you can get out of a package that size. All right, back to the 35 Whelen. Thanks to the legitimacy that Remington gave the cartridge back in the 1980s, many of the major gun manufacturers now produce factory-loaded 35 Whelen ammo, and most gun stores keep some in stock, at least during normal times. For instance, as I record this, Barnes Federal Hornady, Nosler, Remington, and Winchester all manufacture at least one load for the cartridge. 200 grain bullets are probably the most popular and easy to find. You can choose between the Barnes Vortex, Federal Fusion, Hornady Superformance, Remington Core-Lock, and Winchester Super X lineups in that bullet weight. Barnes also produces a 180 grain load in their Vortex lineup. Nosler makes a load with that 225 grain Accubon, and Remington also produces a 250 grain load in their high performance rifle line. Some modern factory-loaded 35 Whelen ammo also has slightly improved ballistics compared to the original loads from the 1920s. For instance, Hornady advertises a velocity of 2,910 feet per second from their 200 grain Superformance load. And before 35 Whelen factory loads were widely available, hand loaders were basically the primary source of 35 Whelen ammo. For this reason, there's still a pretty good selection of .358 caliber bullets in production, like that 200 grain Barnes TTSX, the 225 grain Barnes TSX, 200 grain Hornady FTX, 200 grain Sierra Pro Hunter, 250 and 280 grain Swift A-frame, and the 225 grain Sierra Game King. Moving on to rifles, due to the wildcat roots of the cartridge, few American gun manufacturers made rifles chambered in .35 Whelen until the 1980s. The cartridge still remains almost unheard of outside the United States, though. And prior to Remington opening the door for large-scale production of .35 Whelen rifles, virtually every rifle in existence chambered for that cartridge was some sort of custom conversion, primarily 1898 Mausers after World War II when a bunch of those came home, and, of course, the ubiquitous 1903 Springfield. But .35 Whelen rifles today are a lot easier to find than they used to be. Remington produced the bolt-action Model 700, the semi-auto 750, and the pump-action 7600 rifle in that cartridge on and off for a long time, though I don't think any of them are in production in .35 Whelen right now. But the same is also true for the Ruger No. 1, the Nosler M48, and the Thompson Center Encore. The CVA Scout is the only rifle I'm aware of that's currently manufactured in .35 Whelen. And actually, Adam Weiss, better known as Hootie Hoo, took a great-looking Bison with that exact rifle in .35 Whelen back in 2022. Listen to episode 233 to hear the story of that hunt. Now, as we wrap up, really, just to recap here, one of the reasons the .35 Whelen first became so popular among American hunters was because it was so darn effective on the really big species of North American game. That has not changed, and it remains a wonderful choice for grizzly or brown bear hunting, same thing with moose, elk, etc. If anything, that cartridge is even more effective on those animals now because of advantages in bullet design compared to the 1920s. Now, the .35 Whelen is also something of an underrated cartridge for elk hunting, and it's also a great cartridge for medium game, whitetail deer, feral hogs, black bear, etc. In fact, my grandfather used a rifle in .35 Whelen to shoot his biggest whitetail deer ever. If I recall correctly, that rifle was a Mauser 1898 that they converted to .35 Whelen. But in any case, he had some sort of a hand load. I think it was a 250 grain Hornady soft point. The deer was facing straight onto him. He shot it right in the chest, and boom, it just dropped like it had been struck by lightning. This is the first animal that he had ever shot with that cartridge, and he was very excited to see what it did to it, and he was especially excited to recover the bullet from this deer. And he was thinking, man, since I shot it in the chest, I'm going to find this thing back in the hams or in the stomach or whatever, and I'm going to be able to recover it, and it's going to be really big and well mushroomed and really impressive and all that. Up to this point, he had hunted almost exclusively for deer with either a 30-06 or his other favorite rifle was a 6.5-06 Ackley improved. Take a 30-06, neck it down to 6.5 millimeter, 264 caliber, blow it out a little bit like you do with all the Ackley improved cartridges, and he was just slinging, I want to say 120 grain bullets at a super fast velocity, over 3,000 feet per second. He was using pretty basic 120 grain cup and core bullets from companies like Sierra and Spear and whatnot at the time, and they worked great on white-tailed deer. Very impressive, very fast kills on them, but those were not great penetrating bullets, and so they would often just go to pieces inside the deer or something. Sometimes they wouldn't even exit from a broadside shot on them. So that was why he was so excited about this .35 Whelen. And the story he told many, many times was when they were gutting this deer and butchering it and whatnot, they're looking, trying to find the bullet, tracking the wound track through it, and then they realized that the bullet went all the way through the deer and exited one of the rear hams. And he said that it left a exit wound almost the size of a dollar bill in the rear ham of this deer. I don't know that the exit wound was that size, but he says it blew a chunk of hide off when the bullet exited it. So it was a great story that he really enjoyed doing it. But yeah, heck yeah, you can use the cartridge on whitetail deer. It works great in that role. It's more than you need. It's more recoil than you need. Ammo's more expensive, et cetera, compared to something like a 270 or a 30-06. But heck yeah, you can use it, especially if you're just the sort of guy that thinks thinks the 35 Whelen or a bigger bore cartridge like that is cool, or if you're the sort of guy that does a lot of hunting for bigger game and whatnot, you want something that's really good for that, and you also do a little bit of deer hunting too, and you want to use the same rifle for both, yeah, sure thing. It works great for that, even though, like I said, it's just a little bit more than what you really need for it. But like I keep saying, it just really excels on stuff that is bigger than deer. So going back to the same thing, right? Bear, moose, elk, but also amazing on African plains game, red stag, etc. Basically anything smaller than a Cape buffalo, bigger than a white-tailed deer is really that sweet spot for that cartridge. It packs a heck of a punch, and it has a flat enough trajectory that it is suitable for hunting most of those species out to a couple hundred yards without a lot of trouble. And like I said, the only creatures I would not recommend using it on are really big and really tough species like buffalo, elephant, and hippo. So all that said, that kind of explains why the 35 Whelen fit into that niche that it claimed all the way back into the 1920s, and why it is still hanging around today as I record this in 2023, even though it was nowhere near as popular as something like a 270 or a 30-06 or something like that. It's a great medium bore cartridge, and it's arguably one of the best 35 caliber cartridges ever made, especially considering that it does not require the use of a Magnum-sized bolt face or a Magnum-length rifle action. As usual, I have written a detailed article about the 35 Whelen for the Big Game Hunting blog. There is a link in the show notes if you want to check it out, see what the cartridge looks like compared to some other stuff, especially the 30-06, and you can also see a picture of the rack of that big deer that my grandfather killed with it many years ago. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the deer itself, though I do actually still have the rack. It's hanging in my office as I record this, actually. And if you look at any of my YouTube videos, it's that really big, wide deer that's behind me on the wall. That biggest deer that's on the wall, I didn't kill. My grandfather killed it, but I kept it up there because it was really cool looking, and it reminds me of him. In any case, I talk about Hunting Guns 101 all the time in these episodes. And if you enjoy my cartridge comparison and cartridge profile episodes, you will love Hunting Guns 101 because it's full of that same sort of information contained in these episodes, but you also get access to a level of detail and analysis I don't get into in the podcast. Like, among other things, specific rifles and ammunition and scopes I recommend for different cartridges, the specific situations I think they are best suited for, and why. And you'll also get access to all the ballistic gel testing I have done for a lot of these cartridges over the years as well. So if you like this stuff and you want more of it, subscribe to Hunting Guns 101. I guarantee you will learn lots of useful information about practical ballistics and firearms in general in that training that will help you be more successful afield and fill more tags on your hunts. Hunting Guns 101 is an investment in your education and training that will pay off for decades to come. Click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com/form and fill out the order form to sign up and get instant access today. That's huntingguns101.com/form. And also, if you like this episode and you want more of it, click that subscribe or follow button in whatever podcast app you're listening to. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.